applause for women in science. All right, this next speaker is a regular at Muslimish conferences, and yet he always has something new to say. Ali Rizvi is an author of the award-winning book, The Atheist Muslim, A Journey from Religion to Reason. This has reviews from Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker, and the New York Times Book Review. Ali grew up in Libya, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan as part of a progressive Muslim family before he moved permanently to Canada in his 20s. He is an avid and vocal advocate for secularism, science, and reform, particularly in the Muslim community. He has been featured on CNN, in the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Huffington Post, CBC, BBC, the Globe and Mail, the New York Post, and a range of other major media outlets. So basically, he's kind of popular. All right, so let's hear about scientific claims in the Quran from Ali Rizvi.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me. I love this group. Muslimish is, I think if my book was, it was a group, it would be Muslimish. I'm going to take a couple of seconds here to just, I guess put the presentation here. Something, because this is, you know, a lot of people here are progressive Muslims, a lot of them are ex-Muslims, so I thought we'd do something that's more focused on the Quran and get a little bit more granular. So this is something that I've heard since I was young. So I have a background in medicine and in biochemistry, and I grew up on science, especially life sciences. So I always found especially the embryological claims of the Quran very entertaining. So I decided to have some fun with them. But we'll start on a more, sort of a more local note. You guys know who this guy is? Okay, maybe not the most positive. Yeah. So this is Ben Carson. He's a former Republican presidential candidate, obviously, but he's also the youngest ever head of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. Right. So very well-renowned doctor, very well-respected. So he's not. He's a pretty bright guy. He had a very good reputation before. Now, however, he has also said that evolution is the work of the devil. It's a direct quote. And he has said that the Earth's geological layers came about due to a, quote, large flood. There are other times when he's compared evolution. He said that evolution can't be real because it's like Porsches get with new models every year, so they have to be manufactured. They can't develop on their own. He's actually made comparisons like that. So being bright in one area doesn't necessarily mean, doesn't translate across the board. So yeah, he said some weird things. So what we had when I was in Pakistan, we were in medical school, and one of the topics that you study in medical school is embryology. In your first year, you do anatomy, and in anatomy, embryology is a huge part of it. And this is a book called The Developing Human. I took the screenshot yesterday, so you can see here that it is still the #1 bestseller in embryology. Medical students around the world use this book. It's written by a Canadian anatomist called, and his name is Keith L. Moore. Right, so Keith L. Moore was our version of Ben Carson when we were growing up in Pakistan. People loved him. He is to the field of embryology what Carson is to pediatric neurosurgery, which is a good thing. So this is his classic textbook used across the world. Now in Pakistan, what happened is that we had another version of this. It wasn't just The Developing Human by Keith L. Moore. There was another one called The Developing Human by Keith L. Moore, Clinically Oriented Embryology with Islamic Edition. This is true. So this is the book that we actually got when I was in Karachi, and people loved it. And what happened with this was that, so this book was actually co-authored by a Yemeni scholar whose name is Abdul Majid Aziz Andani. And it had all of the original sections written by Keith L. Moore, But then it also had some sections written by Aziz Andani, with Moore's permission, by the way. And these were embryology-related Quranic verses. Anytime they discuss something, they would put an associated verse from the Quran about embryology or hadith and so on. So what happens is that Islamic scholars, who usually they don't have much of a background in science, they're Islamic scholars, they tend to, like they'll praise the Quran's references to embryonic and fetal development, like it's some kind of miracle. And they say, well, they knew this so many years ago, we're only discovering this now. And now, what Aziz Andani did is he was successfully able to convince one of the leading embryologists in the world, an internationally respected embryologist, and he was able to use his platform to further perpetuate this claim. So, in the foreword to this book, Keith L. Moore did write the foreword to the Islamic Editions book. And this is what he wrote. He said, I was astonished by the accuracy of the statements that were recorded in 7th century AD before the science of embryology was established. Another thing I just want to note, this is a side note, I don't think this has anything to do with it. I'm just going to give you this information, you can do with it as you will. In the acknowledgements of this book, there were a number of distinguished scholars who helped with the book. And one of them was number 6. Osama bin Laden. Again, I don't know, correlation. So, but today, Keith L. Moore doesn't talk about it, so just a few months after 9/11, the Wall Street Journal asked him, they asked him about the book, and when he said, and he turned around, he gave a statement, he said that it's been 10 or 11 years since I was involved in the Quran. That's all he said, he left it there. But how did this happen? So how did Moore end up in this mess? Well, in 1980, he was invited to lecture at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And then when he was there, the embryology department, they took him on a tour, they approached him, they proposed this Islamic Editions book, and he sat there, he was very wowed by them, and he decided to go ahead with it. And when this book came out, I was one of the people who, even then, and I wasn't fully an atheist at the time, but I never understood why he was so astonished by the embryological claims, because they seemed so vague, and they were not only vague, but they were unoriginal. So another world-renowned embryologist named Joseph Needham, he called them a 7th century echo of Aristotle and the Ayurveda. And I'll get into this and explain how this happened. So let's go, this is the fun part. Now we're going to get in and talk about the actual verses. So the first one is Surah 39, verse 6. Right. So what this says is that it says that God creates us in the wombs of your mothers, creation after creation, within 3 darknesses. Or, according to another translation by Yusuf Ali, the 3 veils of darkness. Now, these 3 veils are supposed to be the impressive part. Impressed? Right. Let me explain. So they're thought to, they say, well, it's the abdominal wall, the wall of the uterus, and then the chorioamniotic membrane. That's a membrane that surrounds the fetus. Now, it's not one membrane. It's the chorion and the amnion are 2 separate things, but let's just give them the benefit of the doubt. They're fused as one. They do separate too. So, and there are other layers that are not mentioned along the way, like the subcutaneous fat and the fascia and the abdominal muscles, but they're all just grouped into the wall. So why not? Talk in generalities. It's the 7th century. But how did they know this back then? So supposing it is a miracle, and it's just a wow factor, how did they know it? Well, first of all, the abdominal wall is a no-brainer. I think we can all figure that out. Right? We have abdominal walls. This is a fact that's observable. And you can also cut open a pregnant cow or pregnant goat or any other mammal, and you would easily reveal these 3 layers. And you'll see the fetus that's housed within the membrane. And moreover, apart from animal dissections, dissections of human cadavers were being done by Greek scientists as early as the 3rd century. And you don't have to read all this. It's just the paper that shows how early the Greek scientists were actually doing this. And even cutting open human pregnant women, this is a little morbid, I know. Sorry. She's not pregnant, she was a little while. Anyway.
I forgive you.
So this is something from the, it's a Hebrew Bible. So this is millennia ago. Samaria shall become desolate. Infants shall be dashed in pieces. The women with child will be ripped up. So this was pretty typical stuff back at that time. It's practiced by the Islamic State today as well. They've done this. So people, this is something that, this is not knowledge that they didn't have access to before. Now, the Quran also mentions something called a sperm drop in verses like 23:13. That's up there. Then we placed them as a sperm drop in a firm lodging. And over here again, a sperm drop mixture in verse 76:2, from which humans develop. Now, what's a miracle over here? The miracle is that the phrase is sperm drop mixture, or nutfatin amshajin. Right? That's how I think it's pronounced. And some people they think that they say this is a miracle because it implies that the sperm and egg combine. This is something that they didn't know, that there's an egg and a sperm. Of course, it doesn't say egg and sperm. It just says sperm drop mixture. And there's no evidence that this implies the mixture of sperm and egg. And Aristotle had proposed a mixture of sperm and menstrual blood. This is actually what he thought, that menstrual blood and sperm mix to form a baby. Hippocrates used to think that there were male sperm and female sperm. So this is, again, not an idea that is entirely original. So again, the term mixture isn't necessarily surprising, and it's not original either. But we move on here to verses 53, 45, and 46. This was also something that impressed Kiva Omar a lot. And that he creates the two mates, the male and female, from a sperm drop when it is emitted. So, does anybody want to guess what the miracle here is?
Determining the gender of the child?
Determining the gender of the child. So determining the gender of the child is entirely up to the sperm. Right? The egg is always an X chromosome. The sperm can either be a Y or an X, and whichever one makes it first wins. And that determines whether it's going to be an XY, male, or XX, female. So that's what the claim is, that how did they know this? Well, that interpretation is also ambitious. So well before Islam, dating back to ancient Greece, there was this false idea that the male contributed all of the genetic material for the embryo, and the uterus was just a firm lodging. That's a quote. That was just a place for it. So that's basically what this means. It means that the sperm drop contains all of the stuff that you need for the new life, and the uterus, the woman, all she provides is the housing for it. And since the Quran borrows so much of its claims in embryology from the Greeks, it's not really surprising that so was this. This was completely borrowed from the Greeks. And if you look at it in light of another verse, Surah 2, verse 2 to 3, which says, "Your wives are a place of sowing a seed for you, so come to your place of cultivation however you wish, and put forth righteousness for yourselves." If you look at it in that light, the meaning of this completely changes. Okay, finally. Oh, I guess not finally, but we have the term alaka. Does anybody know what that means?
Something that sticks. Blood clot.
Right, that's the blood clot. So this is one of the famous verses about the alaka. It's 23:14. "Then we made the sperm drop into a clinging clot, and we made the clot into a lump of flesh, and we made from the lump bones, and we covered the bones with flesh. Then we developed him into another creation. So blessed is Allah, the best of creators." And this is probably the most popular verse in terms of embryological claims. Now, a few things about this. And the term alaka is translated many different ways. Some people say it's blood clot, other people say it's a clinging clot, or a leech-like creature, depending on who you read and what translation you're getting into. But first of all, the leech analogy you can dismiss outright. right? Because the embryo or the fetus, it goes through so many physical changes and conformational changes from the level of zygote to fully developed human beings that at any point in time it can look like anything. It really can. It's almost like a Rorschach test or an ink blot where you can interpret it. And so what happens is that you can call it a leech, and someone will think that that's miraculous, because this is something called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. And what you do here, I don't know why they bring Texas into it. Texas always shows up when it comes to shooters. But you take the side of a barn, barns always. So you shoot up the side of the barn, multiple bullet holes, and then what you do is you take the densest cluster of bullet holes, put a circle around it, and say, "Ha, see?" That is the fallacy. It's misrepresented data. So you see a pattern where there is none, and that's kind of how the claim of the leech or the conformation it's FOR, presents. So the leech comparison, you could say that it connotes the clinging aspect, that it clings to the wall of the uterus, and that actually is impressive. The Quran talks about a clinging clot. So that, I will grant, is great. However, it's not original, because Aristotle had described that as well in the 4th century BCE. In his book, he had a book called Generation of Animals, and he talked about how the embryo or the fetus is attached to the uterus via the umbilical cord, or the way that a plant does to a tree. So that's specifically what he would say. But the most popular translation still is clot, or blood clot. So, first thing, the human embryo does not look like a clot. It doesn't. And the second thing is that thanks to chickens, it's pretty understandable why people at the time thought this. Right? And Aristotle described this again. He studied chick embryology in all of its stages as early as the 4th century BC. And this is another book called History of Animals. So, and even if he had it, any farmer, is she stealing my, no, she's, right, if any farmer who had ever raised chickens knew how it worked. You had eggs that were fertilized and they would develop into new chickens. You had eggs that were not fertilized and they were okay to fry, bake into an omelet, whatever you wanted to do. So when we were in Pakistan, it wasn't uncommon. We would bring home eggs, and sometimes we'd find that 1 or 2 that were fertilized, and we would throw them out. We wouldn't eat them. Now, how did we know that they were fertilized? Well, somewhere in or near the yolk, there would be a little red spot that looked like a clot, a blood clot. So, and you can do a Google images search for fertilized chicken egg, and you'll see it. And if you cracked it a little bit later, you would see all of the other stuff. You would see a small lump of flesh. You would see how there are bones and they're covered with flesh and so on. This is a whole thing. And this is something that Aristotle studied. He described this well before Islam came around. So all we have to do is then assume that something similar probably happens in humans. The Quran does not get all of it right, but this is probably where it gets most of it, because it's completely consistent with chick embryology, and this is something that we had access to back then. So, unless you have a deficiency in eggs or curiosity, right, one of the two, you couldn't be ignorant of this back in the 7th century. So, in fact, if someone didn't know this back then, that would be irrelevant. So, there's more, right? Obviously, it's not remarkable here either. It's like clot into a lump of flesh, and they made from the lump bones, and they covered the bones with flesh, and so on. So this is also not remarkable because if you just look at it again with dissection, you know that things are built from the inside out. You have bones. Bones are covered with flesh, and so on. If you've prepared a meaty meal, if you've ever broken a bone, if you've ever witnessed an amputation or a beheading in battle, which a lot of people back then did, this is pretty obvious as well. Now, moving on, verse 32, Surah 32, verse 9. This is admired a lot for mentioning the order of development. The way it seems in English, you can't tell that it's about the order, but the Arabic actually connotes that hearing and vision came first and hearts came afterwards. And you would be amazed if you go online how many people say that this is, it's amazing, they got the order right. Hearing does develop first and then it's vision, and then the hearts. And it's not true. It's just that's not how it happens. The heart starts developing in about 20 days, and then in the week after that, the eyes and the ears develop simultaneously, and then around the 4th week. So, you know, there are many things like this. We could get into the details of all the verses, but if you go online, there are many people. I think is it Wiki Islam, the website? They're very good. They have a lot of these claims that they've debunked in a lot of detail, and so it's, you can really go online and see it. But there is just this. People just agree on this. Many Muslims see these claims and they agree that this is how it is. Nobody really looks at it critically, which is, I guess, not a surprise. Now, there are obviously many completely wrong verses that nobody will bring up because they know they're wrong, and I guess they're embarrassing. Right? One of them is this one. Certainly, we did create man from the extract of clay. We did. And my favorite one, this has a fun little story around it, is Surah 86, verses 5 through 7. So let man observe from what he was created. He was created from a fluid ejected, emerging from between the backbone and the ribs. So man was created from sperm or semen, or came from between the backbone and the ribs. This is the backbone, these are the ribs. Sperm and semen were not created in the chest. This is not. Now, if we want to talk about the upper abdomen, even though that's below the ribs, you know, we can do that if we want to be generous, but even that isn't where sperm and semen are created. They're much lower. But this doesn't stop people from defending this. So I had a conversation about this, and this was weird because it's in the 21st century. We're having a conversation about this. And the guy who is a cardiology fellow, he's an American Muslim cardiology fellow. He's a doctor, and he even wrote a whole post on it. Does the Quran say sperm is produced in the chest? I feel that there are better ways to use our time to write posts like this nowadays, but this is a serious post, and it had all these claims as to where the testes of the fetus are. They're between the backbone and the ribs, later stages. Testes of the fetus do not produce sperm or semen. We didn't mention that. We talked about it's maybe they're talking about the chest of the woman. Right, that's where the fluid is ejected. That's not true. You know, that it's just not true. I think we all know that. But it went on for hours and hours and hours. These conversations, they just keep on discussing them, and that, you know, between the backbone and the ribs.
I'm just interested in what kind of sex he's having. Like,
well, depending on the position, yeah.
I think he has some like grandiose ideas about himself.
Yeah. So it's, I mean, it's pretty amazing the kind of claims that come up and how people, how ardently they defend it. And to me, this just goes to show how, in a way, how toxic faith is to critical thinking. In a sense, if you just believe something, it has to be right. You can have all of the evidence in the world, you can see it happening in front of you, and you will still deny it. But I think the most incriminating factor that discredits all of the Quran's claims about embryology is an omission. It's not necessarily an error, but it's an omission. It never mentions this. This is the ovum. The ovum is never mentioned in the Quran. Okay, the ovum is it's actually more important than the sperm, because not only does it have, you know, people say it's 50% of the genetic material, the ovum actually has more than 50% of the genetic material. Because we also have mitochondria, these little organelles, in the cytoplasm of our cells. The mitochondria have 37 genes. So we are all 37 genes closer to our moms than we are to our dads. So we're actually, which is pretty much the opposite of the way that Islam talks about heredity. So it's not mentioned. Aristotle didn't mention it, Galen didn't mention it, none of them did. And that makes sense because the Quran got pretty much all of its embryological claims from Aristotle and Galen. So, yeah, again, anything that neglects to mention the oath when they're discussing embryology is just not something that you can, I think you can take seriously. So, this is one thing I hear just in general about science. You've probably all heard it. Science answers the how questions, religion answers the why questions. So, you know, people try to reconcile science and religion all the time, and this is the most common way they try to do it, and this is not just among Muslims. People present this as a fact rather than a claim, and you know, you can see why. It sounds nice, it's poetic, there's a symmetry to it, it gives religion a status and a platform that right alongside science, and there's a way of saying sort of, hey, you know, we can all get along here, there's a space for everything. But it's not true. So first of all, religion doesn't just provide answers. Right? It says, you know, religion answers the why questions. It doesn't. It makes them up. It pretends to. So the amount of evidence for the claim that Adam and Eve were banished from the Garden of Eden, or for Muslims, they were sent down to earth from paradise, as punishment for eating the forbidden fruit, the amount of evidence for that is the same amount of evidence that's available today for the earth being held up by a giant invisible turtle. Right? There's no evidence at all. So if the statement said religion tries to address the why questions, that would make more sense. You know, there would be some truth to it. But the way that things are now, if there's something that science cannot answer, you can bet your life that religion can't answer either. Now, it also isn't true. Religion also makes strong how claims, like how the earth came to exist, right? Or how humans came to exist, or came into being. How women were created from a man's rib. And we know that these claims are false, right? We have a lot of evidence. It's very comprehensive. It's everywhere. And we have these questions, these answers to these questions thanks to science. And further, science actually does answer plenty of why questions. Not all of them. It doesn't necessarily address ethical decisions, for instance. But it does answer why, for example, supernovas occur, why planets revolve around the sun, why does nature select some species to survive and others don't. We have very good explanations for these why questions. And obviously if you keep going backwards, anybody who's had a toddler, 4 or 5-year-old child knows that those why questions never end. They can keep going. But there is a reason, I think, that people like to draw on both science and religion. Right? Uh-oh.
I think she got a bump on her
Yeah.
head.
So can you take her outside? She's getting breath. She'll be okay. So, yeah. So there is a reason people want to know, how things. If you're watching a movie and supposing the suspense is building and building and building, and then right at the end you don't see the ending and the movie ends, you're going to want to find out what happened next. Right? So there's a lot of frustration, and life is like that. There's a lot of mysteries of the universe that we learn more and more and more about, and eventually we want to know. We want the final conclusion. And the answer usually is, God did it. Ultimately, all why questions end with God. There was a first cause. Where did all of this come from? Right? So, it was very hard for me to tell myself. What happened after was a big cigarette. So this is, you can only go so far telling yourself that the Big Bang happened because God did it. Because that's a very lazy explanation. Once you believe that there was a supernatural God that created the Big Bang, there's no end to what you can believe. You can believe, oh, angels, that makes sense, winged horses, everything starts making sense. And it can transform you into a cesspool of irrationality. This is one of the problems with the first cause. Now, if the first cause argument, and we all know this argument, if it can be applied to God, why can't it be applied to the Big Bang? If we can say that there's okay, everything was created by God. What created God? God doesn't need a creator. God is, that was the first cause. Well, why can't the Big Bang be the first cause? Right? So it's a pretty common argument. It makes a lot of sense. But in his book, Possible Worlds and Other Essays, J.B.S. Haldane said that the universe is not only queerer than we can suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. And I think this is the most amazing thing about science. And when I read about the Big Bang when I was younger, and I read Stephen Hawking and A Brief History of Time, the one thing I wanted to know, it's 10? Oh, 10 minutes. Oh, okay, I thought you were going to say this one. Okay. That's a lot of time. Okay. Thank you. When I started reading this, I wanted to know what happened before the Big Bang. That was the one thing that was kind of keeping. Like, this is something that science just does not have an explanation for. You know, I wasn't necessarily Abrahamic religious, but I was agnostic about just a higher power. You know, I was much more agnostic about it than I am now. So, when I found out about this is actually what completely blew my mind. And I found out that the Big Bang wasn't just the beginning of the universe, but it was the beginning of time itself. But this is a very weird idea, right? Queerer than we can suppose. It's something that the human mind can't really grasp. So even when you say the beginning of time, it doesn't really make sense, because if you don't have time, the word beginning it's moot. There's no such thing as beginning. So we use beginning and end only if time exists. All of the words that we use today, we say before, after, when, then, now, later, first, last, today, tomorrow. All of these words they're dependent on time, right? They're temporal. And they only make sense if time exists. So time is so ingrained into the nature, into nature around us, that it's very impossible. It's impossible for us to, you know, that you had, Stephen Hawking said that even if God had created a universe, he would have no control over what happened afterwards, because at that point, when time doesn't exist, if there's no before and after, cause comes before effect, cause and effect relationships all break down. So even, it's like when you're, and this is another example I think Brian Greene gave, is if you're standing right at the North Pole, if I tell you to walk north, you walk north, ultimately you're going to get to the North Pole. Now you're standing at the North Pole is right between your feet. And if I tell you to walk north from there, you're not going to, you're going to say that doesn't make sense, that direction doesn't make sense, because you can't go north from the North Pole. And it's the same kind of thing. Once you're at a point where time doesn't exist, there is no such thing as before. So, you know, this is something that totally blew my mind. And, you know, it's complex, it's bizarre, but it's also simple. It's simple theoretically. It's impossible for us to imagine time slowing down or speeding up. But we know that it does. We know that it ticks at different rates. So with our GPS satellites, to this day, because GPS, where the satellites are, they tick at a different, the time moves faster out in space than it does on the Earth, where there's more gravity. So that difference in time has to be corrected constantly. And if we didn't correct it constantly, then our GPSs would be off by about 10 kilometers a day. And that accumulates to 300 kilometers a month. And so this is actual proof, observable proof of Einstein's theory of relativity. So, unlike the Abrahamic creation myths, there is strong mathematical and physical evidence to support this theory, and that's amazing to me, because, you know, when you look at the Abrahamic claims, let there be light, and, you know, God created the earth, they seem much more easy to understand for us, but there's no evidence for them. When you look at something that's virtually impossible for us to imagine, there is mathematical and scientific evidence for this. And this theory is also subject to falsification, as all other theories would be, as any scientific theory would be. And this is not the only theory. There are other theories. There's, you know, the multiverse theory, which is really more of an idea than a theory. There are ideas that there was a big crunch and then there was a big bang, and there was time before the big bang, the time may be eternal. And all of these theories, they have merit, they're being looked at. But what blew me away about this was just the possibility that this could be real. And this idea that that the time could be slowed down or sped up, and then that is a proven fact. And it just filled me with wonder and awe, right? And it made all of the holy books that I'd read growing up, they just seemed so really, really human. It made it even more apparent to me that they were written by men. And so you have a creator of this universe that's awesome and wonderful and unfathomable, something that we can't comprehend. And why is he telling us how much our daughters should inherit compared to our sons? Right? Why is he concerned about us not defying his authority? That he created nebulas, he created black holes, which also distort time. He created hundreds of billions of stars and galaxies. Why is he so insecure and says, okay, all of us, we have to kiss his ass 5 times a day? Right? Ingratitude. So, you've got the double helix DNA molecule, which is inanimate. It's not a living thing. Right? It's a molecule. But it codes for a single cell zygote to multiply within just a matter of months and develop into an entire human being, who then comes and disrupts the Muslimish conference. It's only 20 months, that's all it took, right from a cell. And that cell has the programming and the code to develop into all of us today, who we are, just incredibly complex beings. And so if you do have a creator who created that kind of technology, why is he writing a book about a guy living in the belly of a fish? Or why is he talking about people delivering 200 foreskins to a king so they can marry their daughter? This is actually in the Bible.
And then killing them all after.
Yeah, and then killing them all. Yeah. So this is, I was and I still am to some extent open to the idea of, the God of Spinoza, the laws of physics, some sort of higher intelligence that's out there that we can study. But I just knew at that point that I became a complete atheist when it came to the God of the Abrahamic religions. It just seemed completely petty and human to me at the time. And the embryological claims put the nail in that coffin as well. And it was really hard for me to understand why so many educated, grown adults around the world weren't able to see through this. And not only are they not willing to see through it, but they're willing to kill and die for it. Like, this is stuff that people take emotionally. Like that sperm in the chest thing. I'll tell you, if I went up to that guy, the same cardiology fellow, and I said, or he came, or I told him I didn't think that quantum physics was a real thing, he would just shrug, laugh, and move on. He wouldn't care. But when I told him that I don't think sperm is created in the chest, he flipped out. He took it personally. It was an emotional issue for him because it was part of his faith. And this is obviously somebody who knows better. So I'm going to end with something that I wrote in my book, and this is sometimes when I talk to young Muslim kids, this is how I try to present things to them. I try to get them interested in science. And I would say that even if they do believe in a God that created the universe, supposing you do, why would you go to a messenger or a prophet or a messiah or a book from thousands of years ago to get closer to him? Now, you have access, if you believe that this is a creation, nature is a creation, you have access to it, it's all around you. Study it. And there's a name for that. There's a name for the study of nature. That name is science. And the beautiful thing about science is the language of science, it isn't Hebrew, it's not Aramaic, it's not Arabic, it's mathematics. And the beautiful thing about mathematics is that it doesn't change from the West Bank to Gaza, right? or if you're Israel, if you're in Syria, if you're in the United States, if you're on the moon, mathematics stays the same. And it makes sense to you, it can be demonstrated to you, you helplessly have to accept what you see because it's the truth. So why would you want to rely on faith without evidence when the actual evidence is so much more breathtaking? Right? So ask real questions, don't go for false answers. That's it. I wanted to end with this, I think it's the next one. Let's see this place. A video. This is from the late Stephen Hawking, and he talked about that whole Big Bang thing. So let's play this. And we're good on time then?
No, you're over.
Oh, am I? Already?
Yeah.
Time's relative.
So there is no time for God to make the universe in. It's like asking for directions to the edge of the Earth. The Earth is a sphere. It doesn't have an edge. So looking for it is a futile exercise.
We are each free to believe what we want. And it's my view that the simplest explanation is, there is no God. No one created the universe, and no one directs our fate. This leads me to a profound realization. There is probably no heaven, and no afterlife either. We have this one life to appreciate the grand design of the universe. And for that, I am extremely grateful.
That's it, guys. Thank you very much.
So it's now time for a panel discussion, and after that we will have lunch and a break. So if we could, you don't really need to go to the bathroom right now and you can hold it, that'd be great. But if you really can't, I understand, go ahead, do your thing. So can I please welcome up the speakers from this morning to join us on the panel here. We only have 20 minutes, so ask really good questions really fast.
Good advice.